Welcome to Talking Points. My name is Dr. Stephen E. Gardner, and I'm here with another segment of the 5 powerful life-winning choices. 5 powerful life-winning choices. And today we're going to be talking about compassion. And compassion is the miracle of doing right by others. The miracle of doing right by others. The power of empathy in action. Now, this is a 2-part series, and today I'm just going to deal with part 1, and I'll talk more about part 2 at the end of today's broadcast. Let's look at the definition of compassion. Webster's defines compassion as this: sympathetic consciousness of others' distress, together with a desire to alleviate it. Let me say it again. It is sympathetic consciousness of others' distress, together with a desire to alleviate it. Compassion can be found in research. And I'm going to read a few inserts from the Clinical Psychological Review. This is volume 47 of July 2016, and in pages 15 to 27, here are some of the things that I saw that was of particular interest regarding compassion. It is being moved by another's suffering and wanting to help. It is also an openness to the suffering of others with a commitment to relieve it. Now, the Dalai Lama said that. And it goes on to say that Buddhist conceptualizations also highlight cognitive components, that is, or for example, the ability to imagine and reason about a person's experience, and approaching those who are suffering with tolerance and non-judgment. It also means being touched by the suffering of others, opening one's awareness to others' pain and not avoiding or disconnecting from it, so that the feelings of kindness toward others and the desire to alleviate their suffering emerge. It also involves offering non-judgmental understanding to those who fail or do wrong. Compassion consists of 3 facets: noticing, feeling, and responding. It also speaks of compassion as a deep awareness of the suffering of another, coupled with the wish to relieve it. Compassion consists of 6 attributes: sensitivity, sympathy, empathy, motivation/caring, distress tolerance, again, and non-judgment. The article goes on to talk about that compassion is the feeling that arises in witnessing another suffering and that motivates a subsequent desire to help. It also speaks of compassion being an orientation of the mind that recognizes pain and the universality of pain in the human experience and the capacity to meet that pain with kindness, empathy, unanimity, and patience. And finally, the article alludes to the article alludes towards compassion in this regard. Compassion involves 3 elements: kindness, mindfulness, and common humanity. You can go to that article. I got it listed right here. It's found in the Clinical Psychological Review, Volume 47, July 2016, pages 15 to 27, and you can see what the rest of the article has to say about compassion. Well, obviously, the last two things we've read have to do with more so from a secular standpoint regarding compassion. But what does the Bible have to say about compassion? In the Anchor Bible Dictionary, there are some references to what compassion means. And in the Anchor Bible Dictionary, it says that compassion finds its root in the Hebrew word ahab. The word appears over 200 times in Hebrew scripture. The verb can refer to love between human beings as well as love for God and God's love for human beings. It also says that compassion in this case is related to the love of neighbor and stranger. And two important passages command the love of neighbor, Leviticus 19 and 18, and of strangers, Leviticus 19 and 34, and Deuteronomy 10, verse 19. And you can go and read those for your own inspiration. And in Leviticus 19:34, it seeks to bring stranger into the realm of the neighbor by insisting that the strangers be treated as native Israelites. Jesus cites Leviticus 19 command to love the neighbor along with Deuteronomy 6 command to love God in response to the question about the first or the great commandment, which is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. You can refer to Mark 12:29 through 31, Matthew 22, verses 37 through 39, and also Luke 10:27. Despite the rarity of Old Testament reference to love thy neighbor, Israel's tradition strongly emphasized practical assistance as the right way of relating to others, especially those who are weak and underprivileged. Let me say that again. Israel's tradition strongly emphasized practical assistance as the right way of relating to others, especially the weak and the underprivileged. And this is coming from the Anchor Bible Dictionary. And since we as believers, we who are Christ followers, and we draw our practice as Christians from the Judeo scriptures, there are some lessons that we can learn as the body of Christ on how to provide practical assistance to those who are weak and underprivileged. So the question is, has the church failed? Has the church failed? I want to draw your attention to 1 John chapter 3, verse 17 and 18 in the King James Version. But whoso has this world's good and sees his brother have need and shut up his bowels of compassion from them, how dwelleth the love of God in him? My little children, let us not love in word, neither in tongue, but in deed and in truth. In fact, in the book of James, it talks about that. It gives a similar story that if you see someone have a need and you don't tell that person to be warmed and filled if you have the ability or the capacity to help them. You know, I mean, there's a question. I mean, you got the ability to help them, and you're telling them, oh, I'll pray for you or be warmed and filled. So there's a problem with that. And he goes on to say in James that I'll show you my faith by my works. And so we as Christ followers, we may talk the talk, but when we comes to walking the walk, I believe that many times we fell short because we're unable to have corresponding action to go along with the faith that we profess. Also, we find here is the Greek word, and there it is on the screen, and it comes from 4698 and also in 5062, which 4697 in particular is found in the Strong's. And it says, and it gives 12 occurrences where this word is found in the New Testament. And the Authorized Version translates as, quote, have compassion 7 times and be moved with compassion 5 times. The point of being moved with compassion is the idea to be moved as to one's bowels. Hence, to be moved with compassion, that is, have compassion. For the bowels were thought to be the seat of love and pity. That's coming right from the Strong's Enhanced Lexicon. Well, let's delve into this a little bit further. Has the church really failed? Are we falling short when it comes to displaying compassion? And what then are some of the barriers, if so, that are preventing us from being a shining light in the area of compassion? Is the church, therefore, suffering from a spiritual bowel blockage? Now, I know that's kind of gross sounding, but I want us to get the idea that many times our compassion is constipated by a number of things that are counter to what the Judeo-Christian values espouse. So some of the signs of a quote-unquote spiritual bowel blockage are these. Number one, selfishness. People say, it's all about me. It's not my problem. So we have people that, you know, that are not in the habit, or one of the things that prevents them from really giving of themselves to help someone else is that their focus is primarily on what Christianity can do for them and not so much as what they can do for others. It's not my problem. Another one is judgmental of the poor, marginalized, and compromised populations. I've heard some very idiotic statements come from people that say that they're Christians, and some of that I believe is spurned by ignorance, and other is spurned by other types of misgivings. We read earlier that in the practice of compassion, especially what we read in the Old Covenant and what we read in the Anchor Bible Dictionary and other places, and even in literature that's non-biblical, that one of the practices that must be displayed when you care for the poor is that you must remain non-judgmental. And so I've heard people that embrace Christianity that are very judgmental of the poor and have said dumb things such as, well, they need to just pull themselves up by their bootstraps. Well, if you ain't got no boot, how are you going to pull yourselves up by the bootstrap? Or if I heard very judgmental things of people that are marginalized or the compromised population. And all of these things should not be the reason why we're not providing compassion. We should not be judgmental of those who are less fortunate. Rather, we should do the things that is asked of us, which we'll look further in what Jesus modeled, and that is not to pass judgment on those that are without. One of the other barriers that I found to be very common is political values. The question that I want to ask to those who are listening: does your political worldview outweigh your Christianity when it comes to compassion towards neighbors and strangers? Now, we've already talked about that part and parcel of compassion, drawing from the Hebrew scriptures, whereby, Jesus often referred back to that in his whole discourse on showing compassion. And that is that we should show compassion toward those who are neighbors and strangers. And we find there in the Old Covenant how that one of the ways they showed strangers compassion was to treat them like a neighbor, not to have an attitude or a position that distances them from their peculiar needs. The other one is a lack of knowledge. And I've heard some say, well, I never was taught, or I was told that it is the role of government to care for the poor and needy, and not the role of the church. And I've heard people actually say this. And on the contrary wise, I believe that we're going to model and draw from those Hebraic values whereby the Christian faith draws most of its practices when it comes to humankind and how to treat others. We draw from the Old Covenant. I think that when it comes to that, we have to see that it is not the government's role only to care for the poor and needy, but it's the church's role as well. In many cases, the church can do what the government can. And in other cases, the church should hold government responsible or accountable to assist in providing resources where there's a shortfall. And in many cases, there have been examples of church and government working together to ensure that the needs that are in the public sector are getting met, either through the capacity of the church and also the resources that are made available by government. So it's not one or the other. It's both and. We need to have both the church and also a secular government to work hand in hand to alleviate, the needs of those who are poor and needy in the community where we preach, in the communities where we pastor, and the communities where we care. Another example that has become a barrier as to why churches are not engaged in compassion efforts, and that is there's been a predominant focus on budgets and on church membership, or that is growing their church or maintaining their membership. They say things like this: we don't have the resources or the time. Now, I got my doctor's degree in education, and my thesis, or my doctoral thesis, was entitled this: Leading the Practice of Social Justice Through Evangelical Congregations. And in the research that I discovered, one of the statements made, and this is all based on research, one of the statements that was made is that we don't have the funds. Evangelical churches was talking about they don't have the funds to address the needs of the poor. Our budget just cannot handle it. Or there became other barriers to where, maybe the leader had a desire to do it, but because of the church board did not see it as a priority because of budgetary constraints, or just simply the focus upon growing the membership, and that's taking up a lot of the emphasis, and therefore no regard is placed upon the needs in the community or in the peripheral community of where the congregation is currently sitting. This is in my dissertation. So I'm not just saying this from my own personal point of view, but actual research has proven that the reason why some evangelical congregations are not practicing social justice is because of their emphasis on budgets and their focus upon growing or either keeping their membership. And the last point that I want to make that could be a sign of spiritual bowel blockage is that I've heard this. They say they engage, and I'm speaking not they of just one particular congregation, but I'm speaking of the body of Christ at large. There's an engagement in foreign missions. However, but they have never developed a practical theology to care for the needy in their own backyard. And you know, it's countless, and there are legitimate ministries and churches that have found a way to do both. You know, Jesus said that you will go in and out and find pasture. So they are also providing a need for those in their own backyard and doing efforts of justice and efforts of compassion. And they're also doing things that are across the water and doing the same thing. I think the model for overseas outreach and overseas missionary work is whether or not we've learned to be effective as urban missionaries. And so I see a lot of emphasis upon, well, we're going to raise money to go overseas. We're going to raise money to do these kinds of things. And some of these things are legitimate. However, there's nothing, no entity, no practices, no tradition to alleviate the suffering in your own backyard. And maybe that's because you never thought about it. So we have to develop a practical theology for the poor and needy in our own backyard and not negate the efforts to address those who are hurting in other countries. It's hypocritical to only think and address the needs of those in other countries and not address the needs of those in your own backyard. Yes, I said it. It's hypocritical to only focus on the needs of those in other countries and not have a practical theology that addresses the needs of those in your own backyard. These are things that we can do better. And if we never have thought about it, maybe we should consider it so that we can be not only a beacon of hope and light for those in foreign nations, but also for those in our own backyard who are poor, marginalized, and compromised. Well, what did Jesus say? Obviously, that's what it really boils down to, is what did Jesus say and do? In Matthew 25, verses 34 through 40, we find these words. Then the king will say to those at his right hand, "Come, you that are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. I was naked and you gave me clothing. I was sick and you took care of me. I was in prison and you visited me." Then the righteous will say, "Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? And when was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it that we saw you sick or in prison and visited you?" And the king will answer them, "Truly I tell you, just as you did it to the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me." Jesus is saying, do not forget the least of these, and that we should look for opportunities to do these things. Well, maybe you may say, well, Pastor, or Steve, I don't have the resources to do that. Well, why don't you partner with someone that is? Volunteering. You may not have the capacity, but why don't you send some of your members to be volunteers at a program that's already doing this? They don't have to do it all alone. They may have the infrastructure, but they might be lacking the manpower. There is plenty of work that can be done in the kingdom, and we can't all do it all alone as being on an island. And so it becomes an interdependent operation that if I want to fulfill this and I don't have the resources in my church, partner with somebody that does. Or if I see somebody that's doing this and I acknowledge that I have extra funds or extra resources that I can contribute to enhance that program, I think this is what Jesus is really saying. In other words, we all have the opportunity to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, etc., involve ourselves in prison ministry, welcoming the stranger, and addressing the needs of those that are marginalized. We all have the opportunity to do that, and we can do it either together or interdependently. Oh, here's another thing that Jesus did, and that was the feeding of the 5,000. And it says here in Matthew chapter 14, verses 13 to 21, "Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. And when he went ashore, he saw a great crowd and had compassion on them and cured their sick. And when it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, 'This is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away so that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves.' And Jesus said to them, 'They need not go away. You give them something to eat.' And they replied, 'Well, we have nothing but 5 loaves and 2 fish. And he said, 'Bring them here to me.' Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass, taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and he looked up to heaven, and he blessed and broke the loaves, and gave them to his disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. And all ate and were filled, and they took up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets full, and those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides the women and children." Well, here in this context, we find a dual blessing that's premised out of compassion. On the one hand, he cured their sick after he first had compassion on them. And on the other hand, he fed them by what? Engaging the disciples to address the needs of those right there in front of you. And where they looked at their lack and said, well, all we have is this little bit. I think that's a challenge of what I'm trying to say, is that even when you lack a little bit, maybe I should take my little bit and partner with somebody else that has a little bit. And as a result, we have a whole lot more to work with than when we started. So there was a dual blessing that happened, but it came and was born out of compassion. Not only did the sick get healed, but the bellies got fed. 5,000 men, not counting the women and children. Here's another one. The harvest is great and the laborers are few. And this is taken from Matthew 9:35 through 38. It's also seen in Luke 10, verses 2 and 3. Then Jesus went about all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the good news of the kingdom and curing every disease and every sickness. And when he saw the crowds, he had compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. He had compassion on those who were harassed, and he had compassion on those who were helpless. Then he said to a disciple, the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore, the Lord of the harvest is to send out laborers into his harvest. Now, here's a point that I want to make. That along with our preaching of the gospel, along with our preaching of the kingdom, along with ministries of healing and the like, should also be ministries of compassion to go hand in hand with it. Not only should we be, telling people the spiritual values of what Christ can bring into their life, not only should we operate in the gifts that Christ has left for us, not only for the church, but also to be a witness to the lost, but we should also include within our gospel preaching the practice of showing compassion to others. That's part of the labor that is assigned to the harvest. And I think that that's where there are few laborers is in that part where there's a lack of compassion or some barrier that's preventing it or the like. Well, we can't forget about the parable of the Good Samaritan. And here, this is found in Luke 10:25 through verse 37. And you can see that it's also mentioned in Matthew and also in Mark. And it says these words, just then a lawyer stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he said, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And he said to him, what is written in the law? And what do you read there? And he answered, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And he said to him, you have given the right answer. Do this and you will live. But wanting to justify himself, he asked Jesus, who is my neighbor? And Jesus replied, a man going down from Jerusalem to Jericho fell into the hands of robbers who stripped him, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Now by chance, a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed on the other side. So likewise, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, he passed on the other side. But a Samaritan, while traveling, came near him and saw him, and he was moved with pity. He went to him, bandaged his wounds, poured oil and wine on them. Then he put him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, took care of him, and the next day he took 2 denarii and gave it to the innkeeper and said, take care of him, and when I come back, I'll repay you whatever more you spend. And he asked the young lawyer, which of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? And he said, the one who showed mercy. And Jesus said, go and do likewise. Well, I'm pretty sure we read this parable many times, and you may have drawn your own conclusions. But one of the reasons why the priest was picked on and the Levite were picked on, because they were supposed to be holy people. They were supposed to be religious leaders. And in this particular context, the priest did not want to, touch this person who, that was wounded. He's unclean. And so I can't deal with that. I have to cross the other side. And so the Levite also did the same thing. So you can also look at it between the leaders of the church and also the followers of the church. There's a man there that has need, and both have departed from him or deserted him. And so the Samaritan was identified here is because the priests and the Levites were Jews. And the Jews had a problem, or there were bad dealings and bad blood between the Samaritans. It's almost like giving a Jew, some pork chops or something like that for food. Because why? According to the law, they don't eat pork. Well, so Jesus used a Samaritan that they already believe and agree is a vile person, yet this person that's perceived as being vile did the right thing, displayed the miracle of doing right by others. And therefore used that to say, not only to that lawyer, but to leaders and followers of churches today, that we should go also and do likewise. Well, what have we learned? What have we learned today in part one? Number one, there are both non-biblical definitions and research that confirm the validity of compassion. Number two, it is a biblical principle in both the Old and New Testament that should be practiced. Number three, people of faith should be a shining example of this in every sphere of their influence. Number four, there have been barriers that have hindered the church in displaying their bowels of compassion. Well, if there have been, let us make sure that they are alleviated and we can go forth and do the right thing by others. Jesus provided guidance and great examples of compassion in the gospel. My last point here, compassion is a seedbed for the miraculous impact in our community. Well, this concludes part one. Part two on compassion is a special segment that I'm doing on social justice. And so you don't want to miss this. God bless you, and we'll see you next week.